This is the story of an experience my friend Jocelyn and I had on June 14th, 2014. Obviously, you can choose to believe the following or not. My job isn't to convince anyone, only to document what took place while it's still fresh in my mind. We know it happened the way I am going to relate it to you, so convincing others is of no importance to me. Please forgive me if this story jumps around or repeats itself. This experience was a lot to process and digest. I will leave out details from earlier in the evening that may or may not be related. I will, however, lay out the basic information to give you an idea of what led up to this experience. We were at a place called La Posada in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Anyone who knows anything about this location will tell you it is known as a highly active space when it comes to the supernatural. There are many stories regarding events people have experienced at this location, both from locals, guests, and employees. If you're into that sort of thing, there is plenty of information out there you can look into. However, you won't find anything even remotely like what we experienced there that night. After some strange events upstairs near the room of Julia Staub, which is an entire story in and of itself, you can research if you are interested. We went and sat on a sofa in the bar area, drinking sparkling mineral water and people watching. To say the people we observed that evening acted a little unusual would be an understatement. Nothing overt, but something just seemed off about some of the behavior. At some point, possibly around 11:30, but I honestly have no idea, we decided we had had enough and it was a good time to leave. This is the point where everything changed. In this photo, the doors we exited are at the far left back corner of the picture, against the wall. Directly across from this double doorway is the library room. It had been reserved that night, was brightly lit, and full of people. Immediately to the right of the person who took this photo is the Rose Room. It is also always lit up and connects to the library room along the back wall of the two rooms. The stairwell in the photo leads up to Julia Staub's room. The main entrance to the bar would be immediately to the left of the person who took this photo. This is where things get weird. This part is very difficult to explain. I still to this day can't wrap my head around what happened at this precise moment. I remember opening the door and stepping forward towards the hallway. As I stepped forward, I was no longer in this version of La Posada. It did have the same layout or floor plan, if you will, but it was suddenly pitch black. There were no people, no lights, no ceiling, no floor. There were walls, but only in the sense that you could tell you were looking into another space in front of you, and that space seemed to have an end to it. The library room was still directly in front of us, but it was as if the entire place was set in a different version of reality. I no longer had peripheral vision. Everything was just directly in front of me. From that split second forward, linear time as we know it no longer existed. The strangest part was that I wasn't consciously aware that I had stepped forward into a different version of reality. It's very difficult to describe, but in a way, it wasn't like stepping from one reality into another. There was no noticeable transition. It just was, if that makes any sense. I never had a thought like, what just happened? Where am I? I simply existed in one dimension and transitioned into another one so quickly and so smoothly that it didn't even register. Although it was pitch dark, I could see details. Very precise details. It wasn't like night vision. I could just see in the dark, if that makes any sense. It was like dimming the lights until you reach the point where you can still make out things and the space that's in front of you. Only that point I had reached where I could do this was pitch black. I no longer felt the presence of Jocelyn or anyone else for that matter. I was alone as far as I could tell, but as you will learn later, Jocelyn was there. As we exited the doors and into this different version of reality, we both saw what we initially thought was a very small child. When I say small, I mean really small. Way too small. I saw him as about 3 feet in height. I'm going to do my best to paint a picture you can make sense of. This individual was dressed all in black. He, for whatever reason we both knew it was a he, had long black hair to his waist. Even though the hair went all the way to his waist, I never for 1 second thought it was a girl. I do recall wondering how someone that small could grow hair that long. There are only 2 to 3 instances where what each of us recall is slightly different. He was facing us, and his head was down, with his hair covering his entire face. This is the first part where our recollection differs slightly. Jocelyn recalls him with his head slightly down and his hair parted down the center off of his face. She said he had a very large forehead and a face of a child, but that the way he held his body was much more mature. I never once saw his face, or even his hands, or any skin at all. It feels to me like he may have been wearing black gloves. What we do remember is there was a brilliant cobalt blue light glowing under the hair from where his forehead would be. I saw it that way. Jocelyn recalls it without the hair in the way. Oddly enough, at the time, this didn't stand out as all that unusual to either of us. We both remember him wearing a suit. This photo is a rough idea of what he was wearing, but there are some differences. First of all, the suit was an older style than this, maybe mid to late 1800s. The opening didn't go down as far as is shown in the picture. You couldn't see that much of his shirt. It was buttoned up a little higher. The shirt was more of a silver-white color and seemed to stand out from the suit itself, which was darker than shown in this photo. It was black and may have had very thin, grayish pinstripes. The hands were dark like in this image, showing no skin, which is why I think it was possible he was wearing gloves. This suit was on a man no more than 3 feet tall with waist-length jet black hair. It gets weirder. We also both recall a woman standing to his right, our left, but there were no details to this woman. She was turned sideways and had her back to him. She was also all in black, but was more of a silhouette than anything else. She seemed flat and one-dimensional, like a cardboard cutout. I do recall it felt like she was with him, but not aware of him, if that makes any sense. We both had the sense she was some sort of a protector, watcher, or guardian, even though she never moved an inch or appeared to acknowledge that he was there next to her. It was just something we both sensed or was projected to us. These individuals were standing in complete blackness, not the brightly lit room we should have been facing. We could see nothing around them, but could still make out details of the room. Both of these figures were, for the most part, dressed in black, standing in complete darkness, yet we both saw many details that we shouldn't have been capable of. Again, I realize this makes no sense. I recall them being much too far away, further away than the space of the room would allow, maybe 40 feet from me. This is the second part that differs a little. Jocelyn recalls them much closer, just across this 8-foot hallway right in front of us. However, she still could not recall anything else about the woman to his right, or anything about his face, other than it seemed to be somewhat childlike. This dark space made the blue light coming from his forehead very vibrant, especially considering it was the only source of light. Neither one of them ever moved an inch. This all seemed like it happened in an instant and over a long period at the same time. The first things I remember thinking were, that's one crazy looking kid, and that's not a kid, at the same time. His body shape was that of an adult. He also held himself in a way a child never could. He was slim, perfectly proportioned, and had a confidence about the way he stood there. I had trouble coming to grips with the idea of, that's an adult, and he's only 3 feet tall. The blue glowing light coming from his forehead didn't stand out as unusual at the time. The fact that they were in a dark space, never moved, he was wearing a suit, and that the woman seemed to be a cardboard cutout but real at the same time, simply didn't register. I was just focused on his size, that long straight black hair, and going back and forth over and over. That's got to be a kid. No, that's definitely a man. I do recall that I had no sense of my body or of Jocelyn being there. There was no sound. None. I felt alone and detached from my body. I couldn't turn my head, but it felt as if I didn't have a head, so this doesn't surprise me. My entire being consisted of seeing what was directly in front of me. I didn't feel as if I was standing on a solid surface. but it didn't feel like I was floating either. I just was. It felt more like I was simply consciousness and did not possess a physical body. The next thing I remember is being outside of the building, across the street, and up a side street, standing in the dark on the sidewalk near the car. It happened in the blink of an eye. One moment I was looking at these two figures in complete darkness, and the next instant I was standing outside 200 yards away from the doors I had just stepped through. Jocelyn briefly recalls a moment where we were crossing the street, but she was looking down at her feet. She said these individuals passed by us, but that she was incapable of lifting her head to look up at them. She thinks she may have muttered something about the sidewalk being a little tricky and that the woman may have responded, but she couldn't make out what she said. She sensed them pass in front of her, and then she lifted her head to look at them, and said they were already about 100 feet up the sidewalk and standing where we had our second experience with them. The next thing she recalls, we're across the street from them near the car. This is the point where we are, for lack of a better term, back in our physical bodies in this reality. There was now sound and air, and pretty much what most would consider normal. I assume at this point we were able to speak again, but I don't recall either of us saying a word. I turned and looked across the street, and they were standing on the sidewalk in the exact same pose as before. Neither moved an inch, and he was still facing us with that vibrant cobalt blue light coming from his forehead. It wasn't a point of light. It was his entire forehead. I remember thinking, how the hell did they get here so fast? He's so small. The fact that I was suddenly standing outside, a good 200 yards or more away from that hallway with no recollection of getting there, never occurred to me, even for a second. The blue light emanating from this tiny man's forehead also didn't register as anything to consider. Neither of us recall the drive back and can't remember what, if anything, we talked about. From the moment I saw them the second time on the sidewalk outside, I remember nothing. Apparently I dropped Jocelyn off and got myself home, but again, I recall none of it. While standing on the sidewalk across the street from them, I had more of a sense of my physical body at this time, but still felt like I was in a dream state and not completely back to normal. Since this event, we both went back to the exact same location where we saw them the second time and both realized something else strange. They were definitely standing on the sidewalk across the street from us, but as we stood there later, we realized that the sidewalk they were standing on was much further away. Just as I had seen them too far away inside, they were a good 30 feet further back than they should have been when we saw them outside, as if the street itself was twice as wide as it should have been. This image, which I took, shows where they were standing when we saw them outside from our perspective. They were on the sidewalk in the gap between the two cars, but from our perspective, the sidewalk was as far back as the building behind the cars. I honestly couldn't even begin to estimate how long I was looking at them when we were inside. Time didn't exist as we know it. It seemed quick, but at the same time it seemed longer, because I remember so many details and can still see them both vividly in my mind. The same is true when we were outside. I can't tell you if the entire thing lasted 5 seconds or 5 minutes. Just when I start to think the outside encounter was much shorter, I'm not sure and can't say with any degree of confidence. Neither of us can figure out what happened as we exited those double doors from the bar into the hallway. I mean, we were leaving, so that was the only thing either of us were focused on. It feels as if from the moment we opened that door, we no longer had any control over what took place or even of ourselves. I recall the room was lit up as normal as we approached the doors, which have glass panes, and I recall stepping out into a lit hallway. Then immediately I was looking straight ahead into darkness with these two just standing there. This next part is just as strange considering what we had just experienced. We didn't start to remember a single moment of this experience until 3 days later. Once we did, the more we thought about it, the more we started to recall. We both agree that at the time this was taking place, neither of us found it all that unusual. Instead of thinking, what the hell is going on, it was more like we were both independently just taking it in and observing. We also both agreed that there was absolutely no fear involved, and that we instead felt very calm. Confused, but calm. We also agree, whoever this individual was, he was in complete and total control of the situation. Neither of us could have decided to approach them or speak to them, even if we were able to have had such a thought at all, which we weren't. One would think that if you saw a tiny little man in absolute darkness, wearing a suit, with waist-length black hair and a bright blue light illuminating the room from his forehead, standing next to a silhouette woman in a floor-length dress that appeared to be from the Victorian era, that you'd want to take a closer look to see exactly what the fuck was going on. This thought never crossed our minds at the time this was taking place. We both agree that time seemed to speed up and slow way down at the same time, or simply didn't exist in the way we think of time. There are parts where there is a gap. We were experiencing something in one location, then we're basically experiencing it in another, with only Jocelyn having a very brief recollection of crossing the street. For me, I was looking at them from a position of what should have been the hallway, then from across the street outside. Also, from the moment we first saw them, everything took place in this darkness. There was no light anywhere other than this cobalt blue light emanating from his forehead. Yet we could see them both in great detail. Everything to me, both inside La Posada and outside, seemed like it was bathed in moonlight, which is interesting because that night was a full moon. They were much more illuminated from my perspective outside than inside, but I feel that's because we were back in this material realm with streetlights, house lights, and the moonlight. The only part of this experience that bothers me is the complete lack of control I had at the time it was taking place. I didn't get a negative or malevolent feeling during the experience itself, but the lack of being dialed in and in control does concern me a little. At no point did I seem capable of what most would call free will. I was simply a vessel watching something play out, unable to have a coherent thought or make a conscious decision. I had no peripheral vision or any awareness of anything else other than these two. The best way to describe it would be to imagine that you're part of a photograph, but conscious of being in the photograph. You can observe the items in the photograph with you, but you can't speak, or hear, or move, or make any decisions. I know it's difficult to grasp the concept of not focusing in on this blue light. My first thoughts when I saw Little Man were initially of a very strange child, and then almost immediately the thought of, no, I think he's a Native American man. The blue light shining from his forehead simply didn't strike me as all that significant as it was happening. I just kept going back and forth over his height, and that this wasn't a child. I often wonder what, if anything, other people in the building would have witnessed if they had watched the two of us while we were experiencing this. In all honesty, I'm not completely convinced that we were physically there during this time. Would others have seen two avatars exiting the double doors, turning right, walking down the hallway, through the entryway, outside, and crossing the street? Would they have seen two people walk through these double doors and vanish into thin air? Or would they have never seen us at all? I'd like to think if this ever happened again that I'd be able to think, okay, good. This time I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. But I know for a fact it wouldn't go down that way. I would be in that same lucid dream state and not in control of any aspect of the situation. I have experienced some extremely weird shit in my time, from dozens of UFOs, disembodied voices, sleep paralysis, shadow beings upwards of 7 feet tall, and things I don't even know how to categorize, but was always dialed in and in control of myself without any fear. This was very different. If Jocelyn hadn't recalled the exact same things that I remembered without me prompting her or leading her in a certain direction, I'd seriously question how far down the rabbit hole I had fallen. The way it all came about after those 3 days of not remembering any of this took place was as follows. Jocelyn had gone, I believe, to LA or something to see her father immediately after this took place. At around the 3-day mark, I started remembering pieces of this event and thought to myself, no fucking way that happened. So I called Jocelyn in LA or wherever and simply said, do you remember anything weird about when we were at La Posada a few nights ago? She paused for several seconds and then asked, you mean that weird little guy with the blue light on his forehead? And the entire experience just started pouring back in for both of us. Obviously, in hindsight, the part that stands out as the most unusual was that cobalt blue light glowing from his forehead. We both agree it didn't shine outward like a directed beam of light, but seemed contained to just his forehead and radiated or glowed. Even in the dark space, it didn't seem to light up the area, but in another sense it did. We both agree that whatever he was, that he was probably responsible for us entering this other dimension, but that the woman played some role as well. We had absolutely no control during this time. We were unable to think or act on anything we were experiencing. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. We didn't have physical bodies. All we had were the ability to observe and think to some degree, but it was very limited, possibly as a way to control fear in case one or both of us started to panic. I never saw or felt the presence of Jocelyn or anyone else. It was just me seeing these two things in complete darkness, but able to see in great detail. Being as that this occurred in Santa Fe, New Mexico, along with many of the details we observed, the obvious area of research was in regards to Native Americans, the Hopi and Navajo in particular. Without getting into too much detail, my research led to some Kachinas which I found interesting as shown here. The two most notable being the Hopi Chasing Star Kachina and the Hopi Longhair Kachina. Both just happen to have blue foreheads. I even contacted one Hopi expert who told me straight up, maybe you saw the Hopi Chasing Star Kachina, like it was no big deal. Is this something a lot of people see? And why did he appear to us wearing a suit? And what about the woman? Was she actually the one in control of the situation? We could all probably sit around and come up with questions all day long. Upon further questioning in regards to what the hell did we experience, this person stated, and I quote, "Yes, it is rare, but you shifted into the right dimension at the right time. Follow your bliss." End quote. Again, like shifting into another dimension is like going into the kitchen for a glass of water. I think it's safe to say that this expert was all but useless. I found a Hopi story that talks about their lowercase g god, Masa. According to Hopi lore, Masa just so happens to travel in a blue light. The story goes that anyone who looks at Masa will become unconscious, similar to alien abduction stories. However, no word on whether or not Masa is 3 feet tall, wears a suit, and travels with a cardboard cutout of a tall woman. Thank you for listening. If you or someone you know has a story, whether it be similar to this one or about a cryptid, such as Sasquatch, Dogman, Goatman, the Jersey Devil, something you're not even sure what to call, or something else entirely, feel free to contact me at thecontingencyplan@protonmail.com if you'd like to share your experience. You can remain completely anonymous if you wish. We can record your story in audio, but without video for a future post. Take care, and God bless.